Today is the 8th of April in the year 1920. A man is bedridden and has been forced to move to the house of a friend so that his illness will not affect any of the 3 young children he has. His dutiful wife stands by his side, tendering him. It is not likely he will survive the illness. The man leaves careful instruction for his wife, stating clearly that she should do everything within her power to ensure that their firstborn child gets an education. She promises him she will do her best. When he hears her, he appears to have found some relief from the strange illness that has been ravaging his body. In another hour, he heaves and breathes his last. The firstborn child of this man is Obafemi Awolowo. The man known to Nigerian history as Obafemi Oyeniyi Jeremiah Awolowo was born on the 6th of March 1909 in Ikenne, present-day Ogun State of southwest Nigeria. He will generally be known in his public life as Chief Obafemi Awolowo. His father was Shokpolu David Awolowo. Shokpolu was born in the latter part of the 19th century to the family of Awolowo, a local chief in Ikenne. In his lifetime, Obafemi's grandfather, Chief Awolowo, was a local jurist who headed an organization in their Ijebu Remo community called the Iwarefa. The Iwarefa was akin to a local judiciary where disputes were settled among the community. The older Awolowo was known to be an upright and impartial judge. Initially, he was a farmer, but he eventually abandoned farming and faced local politics fully. As was common in those days, the older Awolowo was a polygamist. One of his wives, Ashefule, was Shokpolu's mother, who was his first-born son. As Obafemi Awolowo grew up in Ikenne, his grandmother, Ashefule, lived with Obafemi's parents in their home in the early days of their marriage. It was not uncommon in those days to find women from polygamous homes going to live in their older sons' houses. Obafemi Awolowo wrote extensively about his grandmother, Ashefule, in his autobiography, Awo. He stated that the woman's love for him was almost reverential because when he was born, the oracle had said that he, Obafemi, was her own father's reincarnation. She would remain a prominent figure in his life, particularly supporting him after the untimely death of Shokpolu. Ashefule died in 1941 when Awolowo was 32 years old and was old enough to support himself and a young family. Obafemi Awolowo's mother was Mary Efunyela. She was the daughter of Awofeko, a man who was known for his military prowess in the 19th century and had obtained the title Are when he was just 43 years old. Both of Obafemi's parents obviously descended from nobility in the Ijebu Remo area of southwest Nigeria. Obafemi Awolowo had fond memories of his mother. He records that she never beat him with a whip, except that she possessed an acerbic tongue, which she generously employed on him when he was naughty. Awolowo notes that he would very gladly have taken the cane than come under the torment of his mother's words. The Shokpolu David Awolowo household was a warm and cordial one. Obafemi records that in spite of the challenges of the time, with diseases ravaging homes and deep poverty everywhere, he felt a certain security within his parents' house. Obafemi Awolowo was born in a period when Nigeria was experiencing both political and religious renaissance. Britain had established economic control over the region that would come to be known as Nigeria from the middle of the 19th century. But the region was more or less governed by the Royal Niger Company, a mercantile company chartered by the British government. The Royal Niger Company had full access to full military cover from the British. In 1900, the Northern and the Southern Protectorate of Nigeria were formally handed over to the British government, and it could be said that the formal colonization of Nigeria had begun at the very turn of the 20th century. Another factor around the birth of Obafemi Awolowo that must be considered as we tell the story of this man is the issue of the inter-ethnic and intra-ethnic violence that was common in most of Nigeria at the time and was also quite an issue in Yoruba land. Between 1789 and 1893, there were numerous intra-ethnic wars in Yoruba land. Prominent among them was the Owu-Ife Wars of 1821, the Ijaye Wars between 1860 and 1865, and the Kiriji Wars between 1877 and 1893. During the Kiriji War, for example, the people of Ibadan were pitched against the people of Ijebu. The Awolowos are Ijebu. This war was also known as the Ekiti Parako War. The war was primarily one where the Confederacy, made up of the Ekitis, Ijeshas, Ijebus, Igbominas, and the Ifes, were pitched against the mighty Oyo-Ibadan military hegemony. The British had enacted a Pax Britannica, where they used their immense influence and military might around the world to ensure that there was relative peace all around the world. It was this same principle of peace, particularly resolving conflict through laws, dialogues, and conflict resolution at law courts, that the British used to bring an end to the crisis in Yoruba land just a little over a decade before Obafemi Awolowo was born. Despite the peace in Yoruba land, generations of distrust still existed between ethnic groups in Yoruba land, and some of it will eventually snowball into the crisis that rocked southwest Nigeria between 1963 and 1965. When the British began to govern Nigeria earnestly in 1900, one of the things they did was to ensure an end to inter-ethnic wars. They reasoned that if the Africans continued to fight themselves, they would not be able to access the raw materials they had come to Nigeria to get. The British divided Nigeria into a northern and southern protectorate for ease of governance. These two protectorates will eventually be merged together in 1914 when Obafemi was just 5 years old. The British also put in elaborate governing machinery to ensure that there was peace in the land. Where there was not enough British men to lead in the civil service, local people were employed. They were given some raw and quick training and sent into government services. Obafemi Awolowo records that around the time of the amalgamation of the Northern and Southern Protectorate, a martial law became a matter that he often heard his father and friends discuss. When the two parts of the country were amalgamated in 1914, the British introduced indirect rule to southern Nigeria. As Europe headed to the First World War, there was a need for more and more men to report back to Britain to prosecute the conflict. This meant that the British had to rely more on the local authorities in Nigeria to govern the civil populace. The second influence that pervaded Yoruba land at the time of Awolowo's birth was the coming of European missionaries to Nigeria. The missionaries came in through the coastal areas, and so those parts of the country close to the sea had greater Christian influence. Obafemi Awolowo's father, Shokpolu, became a born-again Christian in 1894. Shokpolu's parents, who were animists all their lives, exercised rare tolerance towards their son and permitted him to practice his religion unhindered. Awolowo wrote in his memoirs that his father had great detestation for the animism that pervaded Ikenne in those days. He wrote that his father was a conscientious Christian and an unfailing churchgoer, that his father abhorred paganism together with all its numerous rites, rituals, and festivals, that his father taught him to shun everything pagan. In 1920 Southwest Nigeria, most people were still committed animists. Even those who went to church still worshipped small gods in the inner parts of their rooms. These people often resorted to medicine men and local remedies for diseases. Shokpolu Awolowo's commitment to his faith was a testament to the spread of the Christian faith to inner parts of Nigeria far from the coastal lines. Besides, it was also a testament to a man genuinely committed to spreading the gospel in his hometown. Obafemi Awolowo would himself become a committed Christian man after his father's fate. These two influences, the coming of the white man to Nigeria and the spread of Christianity, would be the two leading influences on Obafemi Awolowo as he grew. The white man showed Awolowo that politics could be done differently in Nigeria, and the missionaries showed him that religion can be a bulwark for what one does in life. Despite the fact that Shokpolu Awolowo died when Obafemi Awolowo was quite young, the younger Awolowo was convinced that his father instilled a fighting spirit in him from a young age, and that spirit helped him as he faced numerous political battles in his life. Awolowo writes in his memoirs how his father had taught him a basic principle of life, which is not to go out of his way to look for trouble or be meddlesome in people's issues. However, if trouble is brought to his door, he has both his name and his family's honor to defend by putting up a good fight. For example, one of Obafemi's mates had gone to Lagos and had been away for some time. When he returned to Ikenne, he boasted that he had learned some new wrestling skills that if any one of his mates dared him, he would teach that person a lesson. Everyone believed this boy's report and kept their distance from him. This seemed to have gotten into his head, and so he began to taunt his friends whenever the occasion afforded it. One day it was the turn of Obafemi. He also avoided the boy, believing that if he were to get into a fight with him, he would be floored. But on this particular occasion, Shokpolu suddenly appeared from a distance. He must have gone out to see a friend in the neighborhood, and on his return, he saw his son being challenged to a fight. Somehow, Obafemi got a glimpse of his father. He saw his father crouch and hide behind a shrub, waiting to see if his son would be coward or if he would take up the challenge. Obafemi was in a fix. If he ran away, he would let his father down. But here was the boy who obviously could beat him up, breathing down his neck. Obafemi had no choice but to take up the challenge. He entered into the fight and soon floored the boy who had visited Lagos. Every one of his friends were jubilant. Obafemi glanced at the point where his father had crouched. He was no longer there. When he returned home, his father told him he was very proud of him. Obafemi had learned early in life to fight for what is right, while at the same time standing on the principle of justice for all. Like many African children of the time, Obafemi Awolowo was not keen on having a Western education. It was his father who insisted that his son must get all the literacy he could afford to give him. Even as early as the mid-1910s, it was obvious that there was a world of difference between people who were literate and those who were not. Awolowo recalls that when his father began to take him to school at about the age of 5 years old, he considered it an unwelcome interruption to his endless plays. Shokpolu ensured that Obafemi was in school and made him endure the strict regimen of school life. Obafemi recounts that he did not like the corporal punishment which were prodigiously awarded to erring students in school. He reported the matter back home. His grandmother, Ashefula, was broken-hearted. She could not endure the news that her father, reincarnate, must endure such trouble all because of some education. She cried. His mother, Efunyela, was totally indifferent. His father, Shokpolu, explained to little Obafemi that such corporal punishments were good for him. He pointed at all the important people in the community, pastors, catechists, clerks, teachers, etc., and explained that all of them had had to endure similar difficult situations in life to reach the height of society they now occupy. When it became clear to Obafemi that he was not going to get the support of his father to stop schooling and return to playing, he began to be truant. He stopped going to school altogether. In the morning, while it was thought he had gone to school, Obafemi would head to the farm with one of the numerous relatives who lived with his parents. When Shokpolu discovered what was happening, rather than cane him, he decided to reason with his son and show him the benefit of a good education. Being slightly literate, Shokpolu took time off his work and stayed home to tutor Obafemi on some basic primers. With time, Obafemi began to catch up with his learning. He returned to school and began to do well in his studies. His teachers were very encouraged with his performance, and there was very little reason to administer corporal punishment on him. Obafemi himself began to enjoy schooling and no longer stayed away from classes. Obafemi Awolowo's earliest education was in Ikenne, present-day Ogun State. He attended 2 schools in the early days of his education, St. Saviour's Anglican School and Wesleyan School. In those days, while the political system of the country was administered by the British, they permitted churches freedom to proselytize the people, particularly in the southern parts of Nigeria. The churches found it easy to reach the people by teaching the children of the natives, and the most effective way this was done was through the mission schools that pervaded most of the land. These schools were mostly primary and secondary schools. At the 2 schools Obafemi attended as a youngster, there was usually only one teacher to about 60 or 70 students. The older students were taught in the morning, and in the afternoon, the older student assisted the teacher in teaching the younger students. Awolowo recounts in his memoirs that he found it a pure miracle that any kind of learning could occur in that kind of environment. He would later discover as an adult that those teachers who taught him in his early days were near illiterates. Many of them could only manage to speak a few words in English. Yet, many of his mates in those schools went on to become important and well-accomplished individuals as adults. Obafemi Awolowo's father encouraged him to get the best out of his education. White chalk was the writing material for teachers in those days, and it was almost exclusively owned by the tutors. But Shokolu Awolowo bought chalk for his son to practice his writing. Obafemi would deface the wall of the house with his numerous writings, and his father never discouraged him. Shokolu wanted his son to be a clerk. He was determined that his son would attend the best schools. When his father was alive, Obafemi's fees were promptly paid. He had more than enough books. He had lots of clothes to wear. He lacked nothing. Ikenne, like many other rural areas of those days, was an agrarian community. The real man was the man who could work the land and provide his family food. Therefore, society hoped that their sons would be successful farmers. But Shokolu had long suspected that his son Obafemi was not cut out to be a farmer. He told everyone who cared to hear that his son will excel more as a man of letters. In January 1920, Obafemi overheard his father telling a friend that he was going to send his son to a grammar school in Lagos in the coming year. Awolowo would have turned 12 years old in 1921, and although he was rather young to be in secondary school by the standard of the time, Shokolu was convinced that his son would meet the task. Shokolu's vision for his son was cut short by his untimely death in April 1920. Obafemi recalls that at the time of his father's death, Shokolu had sufficient resources to send him to school. But there was an unwritten native law and custom in those days that said that on the occasion of the death of a man, his properties were to be shared between his siblings first. His wife and children will only be considered last. Most times, the woman is married off to the deceased younger brother, who then takes up most of the assets and liabilities of the dead. Obafemi's mother, Efunyela, was given to one of Shokolu's brothers. She did not favor the arrangement, and so she returned to her parents' house. She took her 3 children with her. The extended family never planned to give Obafemi anything for his late father's belongings. Eventually, someone decided that he would be given a gown. Obafemi will sell that gown to purchase books to hone his English-speaking skills in later years. Shokolu Awolowo had emphasized the fact that his son Obafemi was not to be a farmer, but to become a respectable clerk. In his ordeal, as he tried to get an education for himself, these words from his father propelled him forward. Unfortunately, he would spend many years unable to find anyone to support his quest for an education. Obafemi Awolowo's vision to give every child a shot at education through his free education policies were born out of his own personal challenge of not finding anyone to pay his school fees following his father's death. Awolowo will state in some of his writings that while Providence bestows the gift of children to humanity, it is our duty to give every child, regardless of the social status he is from and regardless of the state of his parents' finances, equal opportunities in life. Some children are brilliant, but they lack the resources to pursue an education. Education hones the innate skill of every person and makes that person better in life, putting them in a position to contribute to society in general. Following his father's death, and while still staying with his mother, Awolowo talked to her about the need for him to return to school. She explained that she did not have the money to send him to school. She approached one of her brothers to help, but he was unwilling to lend a hand in his nephew's training. Throughout this time, Obafemi had tried his hands on farming, but he was terrible at it. Naturally speaking, at age 11, there was very little he could do on a farm. Perhaps those events occurred in his life providentially to prove his father's words to him that he was not cut out for farming. Awolowo's break would come with the visit of his uncle James to Ikenne in the early part of 1921. James lived in Abeokuta and had begun to move up the social ladder, having become a contractor while at the same time working as a farmer. James spoke to Awolowo's mother about allowing the young boy to come to Abeokuta to live with him. At that time, Awolowo's grandmother also lived in Abeokuta, and the thought of Awolowo reuniting with his beloved granny was very inviting. Awolowo's mother would have none of it. She wanted all her children close to her. She had lost her husband. She could not envision losing her only son too. Unfortunately for her, Awolowo had planned with his uncle to elope to Abeokuta. Obafemi asked his mother to permit him to stay the night at his uncle's abode one night. The following morning, the young Awolowo and his uncle left Ikenne for Abeokuta. Efunyela would not see her son again until another 2.5 years. On the 20th of April 1921, Obafemi Awolowo arrived in Abeokuta all the way from Ikenne alongside Uncle James. The distance between Ikenne and Abeokuta is approximately 40 miles, and this trip prosecuted on foot would definitely have left 12-year-old Obafemi thoroughly fatigued and stressed. He was welcomed to the City of Rocks by the warm embrace of his grandmother, who wept sorely at the sight of seeing him. Obafemi spent 4 days recovering from the trip. His grandmother ensured that he got a lot of rest and food as he got over the aches and pains in his limbs. Obafemi was awestruck by the modern facilities that dotted the Abeokuta landscape. There were tarred roads, street lights, cars, and pipe-borne water in the town. He saw white men in Abeokuta but noticed that none of them was carried in hammocks like in Ikenne. They all walked on their foot like any other black person. When he was fully recovered, Obafemi walked the length and breadth of Abeokuta with children of his age and got familiar with the city. The original plan of Obafemi coming to Abeokuta was so that he could continue his education, which had been abruptly stopped by the passing of his father. Uncle James was supposed to help in this arrangement, but he appeared to have other plans. He often preferred to use Obafemi as an assistant in his numerous business concerns. Uncle James was a contractor, a farmer, and a wood fetcher. The young Awolowo was employed in all the fields of endeavor of his uncle to the best of his abilities. He reasoned that if he worked hard enough, his uncle would consider and send him back to school. Uncle James also reminded Obafemi that the plan to send him to school was still in the offing, and the young Awolowo waited patiently. However, by the turn of the following year, 1922, when he was about 13 years old, Awolowo realized that his uncle may actually have no plans of sending him to school. So he still worked with Uncle James, but he also began to make inquiries from friends about how he could go to school. He was reliably informed that some children worked for a master who in return paid them a wage with which they could go to school. Obafemi decided to try this option out. Between 1922 and 1923, Obafemi worked for 4 masters. All of them promised to pay him a wage, but they often reneged on it when it was time for him to collect his salary. One Mr. Kokas stood out of all of them. In 1923, Mr. Gladstone Koka had seen young Awolowo assisting his uncle on a road project. He inquired as to why a young, intelligent-looking boy of that age was on the road working when he ought to be in school learning. When he discovered that Obafemi was unable to go to school because of school fees, he asked Uncle James to permit Obafemi to live with him while he sent him to school. Obafemi moved to the Koka house, and it appeared that finally his woes were about to end. Mr. Koka treated him like his very first child. He got him new clothes, enrolled him in a school, and paid for his books. Unfortunately, Obafemi had to leave the Koka home because Mrs. Koka did not agree with her husband's decision. She would be kind to him when the husband was home, but became very nasty when he went out. And since he was often gone from home, Obafemi's stay in the Koka home was getting increasingly dangerous. He eventually left the house and got his grandmother to go and collect his belongings from the Kokas. For his elementary school at Abeokuta, Awolowo attended 4 schools up to this point: Ibara Anglican, Ogbere Wesleyan, Itesi Wesleyan, and Itesi Roman Catholic schools. At the close of 1923, Obafemi felt he needed to go to Ikenne to see his mother and his 2 younger sisters. By this time, he had only one piece of clothing that was good enough. Granny bought another pair for him and he headed home. When he arrived in Ikenne, he discovered that many of his classmates had passed the Standard 5 examination. Some had become teachers. Others had moved to teachers' training colleges, while some had gone to Lagos for further education. When he was asked what level of education he now had, Obafemi explained that he was still in Standard 3. Although he explained that Standard 3 at Abeokuta was higher than Standard 4 in Ikenne, he went further to prove his arithmetic and grammatical skills to his mates when he was tested by them. At the end of his stay in Ikenne, his mother bought more clothing for him and gave him £1. He determined to use every bit of that money for his education. As he planned to return to Abeokuta, Obafemi decided that he would no longer be returning to Uncle James' home. He determined to fend for himself. He also determined that he would no longer visit Ikenne until he could show his mates something of an achievement he had gotten. At the start of school in 1924, Obafemi Awolowo was admitted at Baptist Boys High School, Abeokuta. He was convinced that he could start off again in Standard 4. At this time in his life, Obafemi had taken up residence in the house of Mr. G.O. Mould. Mould was literate, but he had lost his eyesight and so lived off letter writing. He had a number of young people living in his house and he employed them to write these letters for him while he dictated to them. Awolowo quickly became one of Mr. Mould's leading helpers. In return for their services to him, Mould would pay the students a little stipend or sometimes give them supper. He also accommodated a few of them in his house. This was Obafemi Awolowo's first employment, and he used the little earnings he got from this to pay his fees. But by the end of the second quarter of the school year, Obafemi was involved in a motor accident. He and his mates had developed the habit of latching onto moving trucks and jumping off just in time. The school principal had warned against this behavior, but they would not listen. On this occasion, his friends had all jumped off the truck, but he wanted to prove that he was more dexterous than all of them. He waited until the vehicle had a particularly high speed and then he jumped off. He landed very badly and sustained a terrible wound to his knee. The school principal learned of the incident and administered first aid to the wound. Obafemi Awolowo decided not to return to the school in the new term out of embarrassment. In July 1924, Obafemi Awolowo gained admission to Salvation Army School in Abeokuta. The standard of the school was a lot lower than Baptist Boys High School, but he was determined to make the best of what he had. He decided to repeat Standard 4 in Salvation Army School. He did a lot of studying on his own while at the same time working all kinds of menial jobs to pay his school fees. His grandmother continued to provide him with accommodation and feeding. At other times, he stayed at Mr. Mould's house and earned a little from writing letters from him. In July 1925, Obafemi discovered that his grasp of grammar was a lot better than those of his teachers in Salvation Army School. He therefore sought admission into Imo Wesleyan School, where he hoped he would be able to write his Standard 5 examination. About this time, Uncle James visited him and offered to pay his fees for Standard 5. Obafemi Awolowo refused the offer. In June 1926, Obafemi Awolowo wrote his Standard 5 examinations and passed. He, however, refused to collect his certificate. He was not proud of passing an examination his own mates had passed way back in 1922 or 1923. He was, however, happy that he had attained one of the visions his father had for him. In July 1926, Mr. Kaleko, his former principal at Imo Wesley College, invited him to come and teach at the school. He also promised him that if he took up the appointment, he would ensure that he got a shot at being admitted to Wesley College, Ibadan, where he could get trained as a certified teacher. Obafemi Awolowo took up his first teaching appointment at Imo Wesley College, Abeokuta, where he taught Standard 3 class. He committed most of his salary to buying books that would help him prepare towards his entrance examination at Wesley College. At Wesley College, Awolowo could be trained as a teacher for free, but he would be required to pass the rigorous entrance examinations. When they sat for the examination in the latter parts of 1926, of the 8 persons that came from Abeokuta, Obafemi Awolowo was the only successful candidate. He had secured admission to the prestigious Wesley College, Ibadan. He spent the Christmas of 1926 in Ikenne, where he discovered that only one of his former mates had attained the same educational standards as he. This time around, none of his friends at Ikenne tested his arithmetic or grammatical skills. Obafemi Awolowo arrived at Wesley College, Ibadan in January 1927. The school year in Nigeria often started at the beginning of the year in those days. Wesley College, as of that time, was a missionary endeavor of the Methodist Church of Nigeria. The vision of the college, like many other missionary enterprises of those days, was to train and educate young Nigerian men to become teachers. Often, the school served also to train catechists and lay preachers for the Methodist Church. But their goal generally was that the rapid evangelizing of the local populace would only be better done by Nigerian men who were literate, and the college stood in the gap to fulfill this vision. One other reason why schooling at Wesley College was so beneficial for Obafemi Awolowo was that it brought an end to the challenge of his inability to pay for his school fees. Awolowo's experience with free education at Wesley led eventually to his vision for free education in the Western region when he eventually led government there. Tuition, feeding, and boarding at Wesley was totally free. Although in exchange for training at the college, the students were expected to carry out all the manual jobs at the school. The school would not train the students for free and at the same time employ menial workers for them. The students fetched the wood to cook their meals, they cut the grass around the school facility, they drew their own water from a stream a little distance from the school, they disposed of their own fecal waste collected from an old water closet system, which is quite unlike what we use today in modern times, and they cooked their own meals and washed their own plates. Duties in the school was divided into light and heavy. All students were expected to do an equal share of light and heavy duties. Obafemi Awolowo would soon find out there was a tradition in the school for new students to do all the distasteful jobs in the school. It should be understood that while Wesley College is today a secondary school, in those days it acted as a semi-tertiary institution. Most of the intakes there ranged from age 17 up to the age of 40. It would therefore be insensible for some student who was a little over 20 years old but who were in third year to begin to command around a new student who was age 35. Despite the incongruity in this arrangement, this was a tradition that Awolowo met in Wesley, and immediately he developed a rebellious mindset against it. When it became obvious he was not going to live by the stated tradition, some of his friends from Abeokuta warned him about the consequences of taking up a position like this. Awolowo told them rather matter-of-factly that he was aware of it, but he requested that everyone would mind their own business. In no time, he began to fall into trouble with the senior students. New boys, as they were called in those days, were expected to obey their seniors to the letter. Since Awolowo had already made it clear to anyone who cared to know that he was not going to do this, he was brought to the Students' Court of Justice. He was accused of disobeying senior students, and judgment was about to be passed on him by the judges, who were themselves students. Awolowo requested that he be permitted to state his own side of the story. He explained to the so-called court that many of the people who stood as judges there were also among those accusing him of dereliction of duties. He added that his accusers could not be his judges at the same time. They threatened to proceed with the court process. He replied that he would appeal the case to the principal's office. The case was adjourned and the matter was never raised again with him. Even as a teenager, Awolowo's sense of justice was quite acute. He would take up his love for justice a step further by studying law in the United Kingdom and becoming a famous lawyer in Nigeria. One other occasion that led Awolowo to clash with the authorities of the school was when Wesley College, which was a boys-only school, was going to host Kudeti Girls' School Ibadan. Every one of the students were excited about the idea. It was even suggested that while the event carried on, each male student was to have a female companion to himself, and the teachers were not to intrude. The teachers were to keep themselves busy by hosting their female counterparts from Kudeti. On D-Day, all the students at Wesley College were well prepared, everyone having worn their best outfit for the occasion. Just about the time the girls were to enter the hall, the school monitor, who was also head of students, instructed all new students to lay the table for tea. Awolowo knew in himself that the instruction was meant to humiliate him and the other new students who had been rebelling against authority in recent times. While the other students obeyed the orders, he remained where he was. At some point, the school monitor called out his name, but he ignored him. Awolowo determined in himself that he was going to meet the female students on an equal footing with the rest of the students. He wouldn't have minded making the table when the female students were not there, but he would be caught dead making tables right in front of the ladies they all had made efforts to receive. He knew he was going to get into trouble afterward, but he determined to enjoy the evening as much as he could, and he did get into trouble. The punishment for such an act of rebellion was that such students were to be placed on elongated hard duties, and Awolowo received his own fair share of such punishments. Despite the challenges that Awolowo was experiencing as a teacher in training at Wesley College, Ibadan, he became increasingly aware of the fact that he would not wish to make a career in teaching. What had constrained his choice of Wesley College had been the allure of free education that the school offered. He was supposed to undergo a 4-year training there, but as the year 1927 closed out, it became clear to him that he could do more with his life than teaching. The close to 1-year training he had undergone had exposed him to a lot more he could do with his time. Besides, teachers were so very poorly paid compared to other professionals, and Awolowo was convinced that he could make a lot more money pursuing other professions than teaching. At the beginning of the last term in 1927, Obafemi Awolowo made the decision not to return to Wesley College in the new school year of 1928. He had trouble conveying this decision to the authorities of the school, and therefore decided that if he failed his examinations bad enough, he will be told to leave the school. So as they sat for the annual examination of that year, Awolowo ensured that his results were terrible. When his scripts were marked, some teachers had strong suspicion that Awolowo had not put in his best into those examinations. He was taken to the Reverend E.H. Nightingale, who himself was familiar with Awolowo as being a top student and was flabbergasted at the results he posted in the finals of that year. When he was questioned, Awolowo explained that he had made the decision to leave Wesley College, and he felt that the only way he could be relieved of his bond was if he failed his exams badly. The school principal took some time to explain to the 18-year-old Awolowo why the teaching profession was a noble one and the kind of benefit one could get from it. He urged Awolowo to complete his studies. He also arranged for him to retake his papers, which he passed with flying colors. But in keeping with his words, Awolowo did not turn up at Wesley College for the new academic year of 1928. Instead, he took the second option he was offered of paying back the bond of the free tuition given to him by teaching at Ogbe Wesleyan College for 2 years. His bond required he taught for 1 year, but Awolowo added another year as a sign of his gratitude to the institution. Awolowo's experience at Wesley College was not all negative. He discovered that many of the students who were seniors to him at school and who were also mean and authoritarian became very congenial the very moment they left the school premises. They mixed freely with all the students and treated everyone as equals. But the moment they got back to the school premises, the stratification returned. On one occasion, Awolowo and a few of the students were returning to Abeokuta. The young men often worked and then used the money given to them for transport for some other purposes. On this occasion, Awolowo fell ill and was unable to walk. The same seniors who he had practically become a thorn in the flesh to in school were the ones who took turns to carry him on their backs home to his grandmother. In January 1928, Obafemi Awolowo began to teach at Ogbe Wesleyan School. Since he had just a year of training at the Teachers Training College, he was appointed a provisional teacher and was placed on a salary of £2 a month. Life was becoming easier for him, and he soon found himself in the company of young men who spent much of their time living out the pleasures of the city life. Unfortunately, these young men appeared to possess a standard of living that was way above their income. They wanted to wear clothes they could not afford. They wanted to date the most beautiful girls. They sought to ride bicycles they clearly could not own, and so on. After 9 months of living this kind of lifestyle, Awolowo called himself to order. He realized that Abeokuta, like any other society, was stratified, and to venture to live above your means was class suicide. Everything about this group of men he worked with at the time was not all negative. They introduced him to reading the newspapers. particularly the Lagos Daily News, which was edited and produced by the great Nigerian nationalist Herbert Macaulay. It is generally regarded in Nigerian history that Macaulay laid the foundation for the emancipation of Nigerians from colonial rule. Herbert Macaulay was the grandson of the great Anglican preacher and religious pioneer of the 19th century, Bishop Ajayi Crowther. Macaulay was born on the 14th of November 1864 in Lagos. He was a politician, surveyor, engineer, architect, journalist, and musician. To realize his political ambition, he formed the National Democratic Party. He also edited and produced a newspaper called the Lagos Daily News, which young men like Obafemi Awolowo got copies of in Abeokuta, and they devoured voraciously. Macaulay led a principle in life. He believed that the white man was not any different from his black counterpart. With a solid education and experience, the Nigerian could do as much as the British. For this reason, Macaulay fell into numerous legal troubles with the British, and he triumphed in a few of them. Obafemi Awolowo drank deeply into the philosophy of life of Herbert Macaulay and was committed to imitating some of the principles of his life. So much so that Awolowo and his group of young men committed themselves never to use the word sir for a white man, nor were they ever to take off their hats in the presence of any white man. They resolved also never to fraternize or dine with any white man. They learned all of these from reading Macaulay's essays. Awolowo discovered, however, that some of the prejudices he had against the white man were wholly uncalled for. It took him a while to adjust his mental state about the white man. He would not attend a social gathering with any white man until 1953, a whole year after the political party he led at the time had come to power. Besides Herbert Macaulay, there were certain authors that the man who would come to be regarded as a sage in Nigeria read in his youthful years. Awolowo read all the written works of William Shakespeare. He read Charles Dickens, R.L. Stevenson, Emerson, Lord Avebury, Sir Walter Scott, Hazlitt, Albert Hubbard, and others. One specific book he read between 1929 and 1930 was one that was titled The Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. The book was a collection of articles on well-tested doctrines of applied psychology. Another one was titled It Is Up to You. In this book, the author gives an analogy that left a deep impression on the mind of young Awolowo and never went away. The author explained that if you were to take a large jar of glass and place some large and heavy pieces of beans at the bottom, and then place smaller and lighter beans at the top, if you shake the glass carefully, the smaller beans will fall to the ground while the larger beans will rise to the top. The author then explained that life is like the shaking of a jar of glass. Our duty in life is to increase in size and weight, and naturally we will rise to the surface of our lives and continue to be leading figures in society. The way to increase in size and weight is to build up our mental strength, professional abilities, moral strength, and spiritual life. A man who is built up in all of these states will rise to the surface naturally. He will not need to vie for anything with anyone. His true weight and size will distinguish him in society. Now, even when an individual, by sheer dint of hard work, has risen in life, the only way to remain at the top of his game is to continue to build himself up. This particular philosophy will form a bedrock in young Awolowo's life, such that he will spend much of his life, particularly his free time, building his mind up and working on his moral strength, eschewing women and similar vices that drown young men. He also built up himself professional-wise, and in no time became an extremely wise and capable politician in the annals of Nigerian history. As he continued the process of self-development, towards the end of 1928, Awolowo did correspondence courses in English, commercial knowledge, bookkeeping, business method, and shorthand. During the June 1929 holidays, he went to Lagos to learn touch typing. He also built up his typing skills so that he was able to type shorthand at 120 words a minute, and his regular typing skills were 40 words a minute. He urged Mr. Mould to buy a used typewriter, which he used to build up his typing skills. At this time, he was able to write letters for Mr. Mould without the latter dictating to him. Awolowo would not collect any tip for these services he offered Mr. Mould. except for the meals that the good man gave him. Awolowo had at this time come to regard Mr. Mould as a father figure, and he was glad that later in life was able to be a blessing to him before Mould died. Obafemi Awolowo rounded up his teaching bond with Ogbe Wesleyan School in March 1930. By this time, he had built up his skills in typing and shorthand and was confident that it would not be difficult to find a secretarial job in Lagos. He headed to the City of Dreams and applied for a job at J.W. Jekyll and Company, a German firm. After a rigorous interview, he got the job and was paid £6, 10 shillings a month. This was a lot less than what he had expected to earn, but it was double the amount his mates would have earned who were still in the teaching profession. Awolowo's hopes for a quick upward movement in life were suddenly dashed when in August 1930, he lost his job at J.W. Jekyll. The elder brother of one of the applicants who was interviewed with him in March 1930 knew the head of the company. This person prevailed on the head of the company to give the job to his younger brother. So Awolowo lost his job to an early case of nepotism in Nigerian society. He will remain without a job for 19 months following this episode. Another thing that affected his getting a job at the time was the general economic depression that had hit the world between 1928 and 1932 after the Wall Street crash of 1929. It was called the Great Depression, and Nigeria felt a bit of it. Awolowo did not tire at writing applications though, seeking every avenue to get a job. Luckily, he had built up some savings throughout the time he was working and lived off this at this time. Many people suggested that he take up the clerical examination during this period and get a job as a clerk in the Nigerian Civil Service. He was confident if he did this, he would get the job. The trouble, however, was that Awolowo had still not rid his mind of the doctrines of Herbert Macaulay. The civil service of those days were filled with white men, and the practice was that black men were expected to punctuate every sentence they made to the white man with "sir." Awolowo could not bring himself to do this. He used the time he was without a job to study. He polished his mathematics skills, began to learn Latin, and even flirted with atheism. He found a book written by Robert G. Ingersoll and was enthralled by the man's writing skills and argumentation. Ingersoll took his time to shred the biblical account of the creation, the flood, Noah's Ark, and numerous accounts of miracles in the Bible. Ingersoll instilled in the youthful Awolowo a deep agnosticism. Awolowo remained an agnostic until he returned from England in 1946. Two things restored him to the Christian faith. First was the commitment of his wife Hannah to the Christian message both in word and in deed. Hannah Idowu Didiolu Awolowo remained an exemplary wife to Awolowo all his life. She was prayerful, hardworking, and most of all submissive to her husband's authority. Awolowo recognized the power of the Christian message in the way his wife conducted herself and resolved that the Christian God was the maker of the heavens and the earth. The second thing that tilted Awolowo back to Christianity from agnosticism was his experience while studying law in England between 1944 and 1946. Awolowo's growing agnosticism did not allow him to attend a day of church in England while he studied there. Instead, on Sundays, he headed to the South Place Ethical Society on Conway Hall. At this place, different agnostics took the time to talk to the attendees about life philosophies. He noticed, however, that everything that occurred in these meetings followed a similar liturgical procedure you will find in a church. The Bible reading was replaced with a reading from Charles Darwin, Thomas Henry Huxley, or H.G. Wells. The hymn singing was replaced with hymns from a book titled Hymns of Modern Thoughts. There were no prayers. Awolowo concluded that human beings are naturally built to worship something. You either worship God, or you worship an idol, or you worship your own thinking, or past philosophers. Awolowo discovered that it was safer for him to worship the biblical God rather than the inventions of men. Eventually, he renounced his belief in agnosticism and returned to the God of the Bible. Obafemi Awolowo's commitment to the Christian message will be seen in the numerous social concerns he carried out while he was in government. Unlike many who tend to use religion for political advantage, Obafemi Awolowo kept his devotion to God as a very private matter. His mother, Efonyela, was an animist most of her life. Her own mother had dedicated her to the river gods and had instructed Shokolu, her husband, not to change her faith. At about the time Awolowo returned to the Christian faith, he helped his mother to appreciate the falsehood in animism and led her to faith in Jesus Christ. Efunyela died a committed Christian. Obafemi Awolowo's Christian faith has also been questioned by many who believe that his Rosicrucianism could not be reconciled with the teachings of the Bible. The fact remains, however, that Awolowo was a man of his time. He responded in faith to the facts that he had in his hands. He was an extremely brilliant mind who read widely and might have tried to reconcile his grandmother's faith with the faith that was exemplified by his wife. These two women remain the greatest object of love and learning for Obafemi Awolowo, and Rosicrucianism may have just been a middle ground for him. Obafemi Awolowo maintained a positive outlook on life, and Rosicrucianism might have helped him in this regard. Some claim that Awolowo used fetish powers in his politics. When one remembers that Shokolu, his father, had disabused his mind of fetish powers as a child, one will understand why Obafemi Awolowo could never have employed fetish powers in his politics. He was a man with very strong faith in God, a faith that was built up throughout his life, following the death of his father, and a faith that became even stronger as he waded through the dirty waters of Nigerian politics. Dr. Mrs. Tokunbo Awolowo Dosomu, the last and only surviving child of the sage, stated in a recent interview that towards the end of his life, her father said that God answered all his prayers in this life, except his prayer and desire to rule Nigeria. Only a man with sincere faith in the true God of the universe can speak like that. It is, however, important to note the development of Awolowo's view of God in his younger years, because it will influence a lot of the things he will do in politics in later life. After spending 19 months without a job between 1930 and 1932, one day in April 1932, he received a telegram from his cousin, Simon Awolowo, that the post of college clerk was vacant at Wesley College, Ibadan. Immediately, Awolowo headed to Ibadan and applied for the job in person. Of the 3 persons interviewed for the post, Obafemi Awolowo got the job. The skills he had built up in typing and shorthand came in handy here. Also, the knowledge he had acquired from years of studying bookkeeping and business became very helpful for him in his work. He had just turned 23 that year and was full of zest and energy for work. He put in extra work into his job, often working in the office outside office hours to meet given deadlines. His duties included typing examination questions for students in the various fields of training at the college. He was at Wesley College for 2.5 years, and when he left in August 1934, the school principal, Edward G. Nightingale, wrote him a glowing recommendation. He wrote, "Mr. Obafemi Awolowo has been employed as a clerk at this college since April 1932. His work has been chiefly correspondence and copying. He has taken down letters, etc., to dictations at a reasonable quick rate, and is a rapid and accurate copyist. He is thoroughly conversant with the cutting of stencils for duplicating work. In the course of his duties, a considerable amount of confidential matters have passed through his hands, and his honesty and discretion have never been in question. He is resigning on his own initiative in order to secure a better salary, and have pleasure in recommending him to anyone requiring an efficient office assistant." What is most interesting about this recommendation is that the principal was silent about Awolowo's clear irreligiosity, which he made no attempt to hide while he worked at the school. Wesley College of those days was a mission work of the Methodist churches, and the least that is expected of an employee of the institution is to at least be in church on Sundays. Obafemi Awolowo, however, did not step into the chapel of that school throughout his employment there. Once the principal asked him why he did not go to church, Awolowo replied that the only thing that interests him in church is the singing from the college choir, and since his room was close enough to the chapel, he could hear the songs from there. There was no point going to church for that. To the credit of the Reverend E.J. Nightingale, he never coerced Awolowo to go to church. One could say that whatever Awolowo lacked in religious beliefs in those days, he made up for it in the extremely diligent and efficient work he brought to the office as the clerk at Wesley College, Ibadan. At the turn of 1934, Obafemi Awolowo's leading ambition was to someday find the resources to study law in the United Kingdom. He was 25 years old that year, and he was convinced that he had the mental acuity, both in knowledge and experience, to sit for the London matriculation examination. This was an entrance examination that was offered to students who were seeking admission to universities in the United Kingdom. In January 1934, Awolowo took this examination and failed. He, however, did not allow this to set him back. He put in more effort into some correspondence courses he was doing in journalism. His salary as a clerk at Wesley College was £3 a month, and he was convinced that with such a paltry amount, he could never save enough to study law in the United Kingdom. He made strenuous efforts to the school authorities to increase his salary, emphasizing the fact that his wages were only equal to those of qualified teachers from the school. He argued that the work he was putting into the office was way beyond what any teacher could bring to the classroom. Yet, the school would not increase his wages. Obviously, the missions were running on a very lean budget, and an increase in the wages of one staff will upset the balance of things. This was about the time that Awolowo made up his mind to leave Wesley College and was given that worthy recommendation by his principal, who stated that Awolowo was leaving the job because she was hoping to get better income in another job. On his birthday that year, 6th of March 1934, Obafemi Awolowo resolved no longer to smoke cigarettes. He had picked up the habit during his years in Abeokuta when he walked the town with young men who sought ever to associate with people in the higher strata of society. Awolowo reasoned that his health would be a lot better if he kicked the habit of smoking. In September 1934, Awolowo began his journalistic career with the Nigerian Daily Times. He was paid £2 a month for this job, but he could earn a lot more for each story he brought to the paper. He was with the Daily Times for 8 months. 3 of those he spent as a trainee without pay, and the remaining 5 he was sent to Ibadan as the paper's correspondent in that city. It was while working with Daily Times that the vision to someday own a newspaper house was brought in him. In 1934, journalism was still very much in its nascent form in colonial Nigeria. Journalists were poorly paid, even though the public had great regard for them, mainly because the journalist was greatly feared. The leading papers of this period were the Nigerian Daily Times, Lagos Daily News, Nigerian Daily Telegraph, and a few others. Lagos Daily News was published by Herbert Macaulay, but by this time the nationalist was growing older and losing most of his zest he had for politics. Macaulay had fallen out of favor with a lot of his supporters and could barely keep the paper afloat. It should be noted, however, that each time the paper managed to bring out an edition during these dying days, it sold out completely in the market. It was this vacuum or need in the journalistic space that Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe sought to exploit when he battered the West African Pilot in 1937. At the time, the Pilot, as it would generally be known, was the best funded paper in the country. It entered the Nigerian journalistic market and quickly reaped from the never-ending news that a country that like Nigeria was always producing. When Dr. Azikiwe returned to Nigeria from the United States in 1934, where he had gone to get a PhD, Awolowo quickly became an enthusiastic listener of the man. He had read Zik's newly published book, Liberian World Politics, and was quickly coming to grasp with his ideology with regards to national issues. The Nigerian Daily Times sent Awolowo to cover a few of Azikiwe's lectures. Awolowo covered Zik's first lecture titled There is Joy in Scholarship. Zik gave this lecture towards the end of 1934 at the Methodist Boys High School, Lagos. The audience that attended the lecture was small, but that lecture soon made Zik to be extremely popular among Lagos residents, so that every other lecture he delivered from that time on attracted thousands of enthusiastic listeners. In 1935, Awolowo reached the point in life where he felt that he would do better financially working as a freelancer for the Nigerian Daily Times. As a freelancer, he wrote hundreds of articles for newspapers within Nigeria and some abroad. Many of the articles he sent abroad at this time were generally not well received. The editors would write back and explain that the tone of his articles were too controversial, that the reading public in Britain was averse to an African lampooning the colonial system. Awolowo at some point decided to temper his words, and so he wrote a piece on Shakespeare. He sent this article to the Nigerian Daily Times. Even this one was not published. The editor told him that the subject he wrote about was bigger than his name. Awolowo then sent the same article to the Weekly Comet, who published it and sent back a glowing commendation. The years between 1934 and 1940 would be training years for Obafemi Awolowo in writing and journalism. By the time he had gone to the United Kingdom and returned as a qualified lawyer, his articles were becoming increasingly accepted in newspapers. Even as a student in the United Kingdom, Obafemi Awolowo never stopped writing freelance. Via his writing, he would make the acquaintance of Mr. Albert Cartwright, a white South African. Cartwright was the editor of West Africa, a magazine. Cartwright ensured that every article Obafemi Awolowo sent him was published. He also paid him for it. In those days, to have your photograph published in a newspaper, you had to pay for a block of space for it. Awolowo's photograph was first published in the Nigerian Daily Times in 1945 in an open letter he had written to Sir Otto Richardson on the Richardson Constitution of 1945. It was S.L. Akintola, who was editor of the paper at the time, who got his employers to pay for that block for which Awolowo's photograph was published. When Obafemi Awolowo left the Nigerian Daily Times and ventured into freelancing, he also made up his mind to go into business. The whole aim of entering into business in the 1935-1936 period was so that he could earn enough money to send himself to the United Kingdom to study law. The first business he ventured into was money lending. Awolowo found out that many civil servants were not wise in the use of their money. Because of the certainty of a salary that would arrive at the close of the month, civil servants will often never live within their means. They will borrow money from money lenders and never minded the exorbitant interest that was placed on it. Awolowo started with a capital of £90. A friend had added £30 to the sum, and he made a lot of money in the process. The trouble with money lending, however, was that borrowers found it difficult to pay back. Awolowo eventually diversified from money lending and began produce buying and selling. He also started public letter writing under the Illiterate Protection Ordinance. As the name goes, this is an ordinance that the colonial government had passed in Lagos on the 15th of June 1896, which helped people who were not literate have their documents written by a literate person. Awolowo realized a lot of money from public writing that he began to wonder why he had not embarked on the business in the 19 months he was without a job in Lagos. At the same time, Awolowo ventured into transport business. He raised the capital of £650, got 2 taxis and a lorry, and started transportation. The business came with a lot of challenges, as too many times the drivers were not honest. The street was filled with policemen who were ever demanding, and the vehicles themselves had never-ending problems. It was at this time Awolowo decided on joint business with others. Awolowo extended his produce buying and selling to a cooperative system in 1836. He invited a few of his friends to the cooperative system and called it the Progressive Economic Corporation. Their aim was that as a group of people, they will pool resources together and embark on business ventures. Profit would then be shared based on the amount of investment each person brought to the corporation. What was also agreed but remained unwritten was that losses were equally to be shared. They were to deal in cocoa, palm kernel, and cotton. The focus on doing business on these products in the 1936-1937 years was extremely lucrative, and as predicted, it turned out to be so. The cooperative made a lot of money, with all members getting handsome interest on their investments. A few people took hold of their profit and left, but most of the members plowed back their profit into the business because the 1937-1938 year had even better forecasts. Obafemi Awolowo had made enough money from this business to embark on his studies in the United Kingdom. But 1937 was the year he had hoped to be married, so he postponed his travel another year with the hope that the coming year will yield even greater profit and allow him to take his wife along with him to the United Kingdom. As things turned out, this would not be. The 1937-1938 year was completely comatose for business in cocoa. There was a big slump in the prices of the product that year, and the cooperative lost all its profit. In fact, by the time he was getting married to his wife on Sunday, 6th of December 1937, Awolowo was on the brink of bankruptcy. He was in this state until 1942, before he was finally out of debt. Awolowo had been elected by the cooperative group as their agent, and even though there were practically no legal terms binding all members, everyone blamed the losses of the cooperative on him. When some members began to threaten legal actions, Awolowo spoke to a lawyer about the situation. The man charged him a guinea to listen to him. He then charged him 10 guineas to offer him legal counsel on the matter. Awolowo did not have the money, so he did a little research himself. He then wrote all the members of the cooperative a letter, explained the situation as best as he knew how. He made them understand that a cooperative group like the one they had was meant to share both assets and liabilities. He showed them that just as they shared the asset, they were equally meant to share all liabilities. It was only after he wrote this letter that many of the members stopped pestering him. He was now left with paying off the debt he owed to many farms the cooperative owed money. One of such farms, which he owed about the least amount of money, decided to auction off his house, his car, and his personal belongings. He managed to retrieve the house from the buyer in 1941. He got a few of his friends to help purchase his personal belongings and paid them the money back. In fact, on the 8th of May 1939, as they sold off his personal belongings, Awolowo made sure he was right there at the venue so that his properties were not undervalued. A lot of people were surprised to see him standing at the very place where his things were being auctioned off. Awolowo cared very little about what they thought of him. Despite the economic downturn that had befallen him, Obafemi Awolowo ensured that his spirit was not weighed down. He resumed studying for the London matriculation examination at about this time. He remained the secretary of the Nigerian Youth Movement, Ibadan chapter. He was an executive member of the Yaba Club, assistant general secretary of the Nigerian Motor Transport Union, secretary of the Ibadan branch of the Nigerian Produce Traders Association, and the literary secretary of the Wesley Guild. Awolowo had begun to learn in this period to build up fortitude in himself. On his 30th birthday, the 6th of March 1939, Obafemi Awolowo wrote in his diary, "After rain comes sunshine, after darkness comes the glorious dawn. There is no sorrow without its alloy of joy. There is no joy without its admixture of sorrow. Behind the ugly, terrible mask of misfortune lies the beautiful, silken countenance of prosperity. So tear the mask." He wrote these words at some of the lowest periods of his life. These words also depict a young man coming to grips with the issues of life and a certainty that he would emerge victorious from every trouble. When Awolowo penned these words, he had no idea the things that the future held for him. He would have his own fair share of misfortune and challenges in life, but in them all, he tore the mask and emerged stronger and better. In 1959, just as he was leaving office, having led the Western region as premier, Obafemi Awolowo came across a document that listed the names of people who belonged to the Progressive Economic Cooperative. He felt a strong urge within him to return each person's investment. He was not under any legal duty to do this, but he did it anyway. When they received their money, many of the people appreciated him for this. Others sent the money back to him, explaining that they understood very well that they were to share in both the losses and profits of the organization. It should be noted that although Obafemi Awolowo will come to be known as a man of great intellectual fortitude, moral excellence, and courage, the years between 1938 and 1944 were possibly the lowest period of his life. He often admitted to his long-suffering wife that he had the feeling that his life will consist of one of unending difficulty. Having lost his father when he had just turned 11, Awolowo often expressed the fear that his life would be one of permanent difficulties and failures. Awolowo's wife Hannah should, however, be credited for having been the fortitude behind the great man in his most vulnerable moments. Many women who are newly married will not endure bankruptcy with any man. Hannah Awolowo not only supported her husband in these times, but she also ensured that he was not unnecessarily weighed down with the care of the family while he embarked on his trip to the United Kingdom to study law between 1944 and 1946. She ensured that his mind was kept at rest with regards to the home front. She took the £20 Awolowo had given her to care for the family, invested it in business, and made enough money to care for 4 children while her husband was away. She even sent him money on 4 different occasions while he was studying abroad. Obafemi Awolowo owed his success in life to 3 things: the grace of God, a Spartan and disciplined lifestyle, and a supportive wife. Obafemi Awolowo described his wife as his jewel of inestimable value, the man who will break into Nigeria's national life and helped propel her to new life, started his early life with many challenges. Many of those challenges will form the foundation with which he faced a lot more challenges that life will bring his way in the days to come. After their wedding, the Awolowo brood came in almost immediately. Segun was born in 1938, Omotola was born in 1940, Oluwole was born in 1942, Ayodele was born in 1945, and Tokumbo was born in 1948. In the period between 1937 and 1942, Awolowo engaged in all kinds of business to pay off his debt and to provide for his family. By December 1942, Obafemi Awolowo was free of all debt. That same year, he launched a 10-year plan for himself. He determined that in 5 years, he planned to acquire a degree in law to help aid him in his professional pursuit. He also hoped that in 10 years, he would have launched into politics full-time. Obafemi Awolowo came to the realization in life that his calling was to be a politician. He realized that if society was properly run, most people would occupy the middle class of society. Also, the rich will be taxed to provide social amenity for all. These philosophies will eventually be properly spelled out in his books as democratic socialism. But even at this point in his life, the philosophies that will run his politics were already working out in his life. Awolowo had suffered great deprivation as a child because of the loss of his father. He reasoned, however, that in a working society, the absence of a father need not impugn on the chances of a child who had the capacity to reach great heights in life. Awolowo's politics essentially center on providing a level playing field for everyone in society, regardless of whether you were born poor or rich. Awolowo would achieve his 10-year plan. In 1946, he was called to bar as a lawyer. In 1951, the Action Group was formed.
Bẹ́sí ń bá pé ó bí kò ṣolúwo mi o.